Good morning. You can have a seat. Thank you for being with us today. This greeting time, don't underestimate how much that means to the people around you. That is not just because you're an extrovert. Would you love something like that? But I think that is a beautiful picture of what we read about in the first century church, especially just how they did life together. And so it's a beautiful thing to watch. But now it's time to stop all that craziness. And no, I'm just kidding. I want to begin by telling a story about a season of my life, a time when I stumbled my way through several jobs, some of them part-time, some of them full-time, but I had a number of different jobs in a very short amount of time. And the difficult part for me in that season wasn't that I had to learn new systems or get acclimated to new bosses or wonder if, ends were going to meet and bills were going to be paid. To me, the really challenging part was the blow that it was to my identity. It was a season where I began to learn the hard way that I had been basing my identity, who I was as a man, on what I did for a job. And some of the responsibilities that go with that and that title. For several years prior to that season of my life, I was a pastor, pastored in different settings, but most recently I was serving as a pastor in a church that, from St. Louis standards, was a pretty prominent church. And so I transitioned from that into this season of several different jobs, job titles, and as I said, just kind of wrestling with who I was. I worked in corporate America for a little bit. It was my stint in a cube, for those of you that do that day in and day out. God bless you. I don't know how you do it, but I worked in corporate America for a little bit. I was doing some personal training. I was a barista at Starbucks. I was, you name it, just trying to earn a buck here and there. And one day I was getting my hair cut, and as a part of making conversation, the lady that was cutting my hair asked what I did for a job. And to this day, I still think through what went through my mind in that split second before I answered. And I'm not sure all of the psychological reasons why I answered her the way that I did, but I replied without hesitation, I am a pastor. Now that could be a good thing that I, even though I'm not a vocational minister, that I still consider myself to be a minister in the sense that everyone who is a Christ follower is called to minister to others. We all are pastors of our families, or we shepherd a flock of people, we make disciples, all of that. If that had been what I meant that day when I was getting my hair cut, then that would have been a really good thing. But truth be told, I just said a bold-faced lie that day, because I was so uncertain of who I was apart from a particular title. So for my shifts at Starbucks, and I just kind of maintained, and I've even thought about, that my conversation with the lady as I was getting my hair cut, if I'm gonna lie about my vocation, I should have really picked something good, don't you think? Well, I'm a professional athlete. Maybe you've seen me on Sundays. I'm an outside linebacker, or a doctor or a lawyer or something. But anyway, I chose pastor. And so I'm at Starbucks. I'm working this job. I'm a barista at Starbucks. And I always loved going to Starbucks. I just, through this season of my life, found out I prefer one side of the counter to the other. It's basically what it was. But early on, as I'm getting acclimated to this new job, I met this one girl that I worked for, and so I asked her. I said, I'm thinking, what Starbucks long term? Could I work my way up in the company and do something? Maybe that's what I'm supposed to do with my life. And so I asked her, I said, so why Starbucks? Why are you a manager at Starbucks? And she said, well, I don't know. I was in high school and thought it'd be like a really cool first job, And it was at that moment that I thought, gee, Jiminy's, I have just thrown my life away. What am I doing here? Again, it's just because I struggle so much. And one of the things that we had to do at the beginning of every shift, we had a little laminated card that was blank, and we were to label our individual cash drawer that we were assigned for that shift. And we would write our name and our job title on that card. And so I would write Gary Barista as opposed to Bubbles Manager. And whoever, I don't even remember her name, but I would write Gary Barista, and I put that on my cash drawer. And that was, in this season of my life, is when I was really wrestling with the big question of identity. Up to that point, I had spent years studying God. I had spent years trying to better understand who Jesus was, but I didn't know who I was. And this was a really difficult wilderness season for me. Now, I'm gonna pause the story there. I'm gonna come back to it in a little bit, and I want to prepare us as we walk into this new passage that we're going to look at in Matthew and remind us of the series, the King's Speech. I love the decorations that we have and the crowns. And what we are doing is we're walking through the Gospel of Matthew. And early on in his Gospel, what he is doing is he is introducing us to the King. And then we're going to ask ourselves the question, who is this King, or what is the King saying to us, and what does he require of us? And so Matthew is laying out this foundation that Jesus is the King. And so really all throughout this series, as over the next several weeks, as we go verse by verse and story by story through the Gospel of Matthew, that's a question that we can ask ourselves. What is the King saying, and what does he require of us? And even though they're individual stories, I just want to mention to you that they do fit together. Matthew didn't just kind of pick his favorite stories. He told them in an order, and they do build on each other, and the surrounding context is important. So if you're unable to make it on a Sunday, I do encourage you to go online and check out the messages that you missed, centralsj.org. If you weren't here last week, let me give you a recap of a portion of what Glenn was talking about. We started off in Matthew 3, and as Glenn mentioned, we covered a lot of the content of Matthew 1 and 2 in our Christmas Not Crazy series, talking about the birth of Christ. And so as we started last week in Matthew 3, what we have is this picture of John the Baptizer, John the Baptist, beginning his ministry out in the wilderness. And he is attracting quite a following as people are going out to the wilderness to be baptized by him. And Glenn was talking about how this was a different baptism. This was unique to the Jewish people of that day. It was common for Gentiles to be baptized as they converted to Judaism, but for Jews themselves to be baptized, this was a new thing. And his baptism was a baptism of repentance, a baptism for the forgiveness of sins. And it was a commitment to live a holy life. And so here we see people flocking to John and sensing that he is offering something that's different than the religious leaders that they were used to. And so it's in this setting that we get to the passage that we're going to look at today, Matthew 3, beginning in verse 13. And we are going to do this also as a part of each service, but we're going to ask you to stand as we read God's word. And you can follow along. It'll be on the screens. We encourage you, maybe you want to use a Pew Bible, or you've already got it pulled up on your Bible app. But I'll be reading for us here. Then Jesus came from Galilee to the Jordan to be baptized by John. But John tried to deter him, saying, "I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me?" Jesus replied, "Let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness." Then John consented. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was open, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Again, we have 2 Catholics in our service today. All right. It may be associated, that phrase, "This is the word of the Lord, thanks be to God." Yes, you can be seated. We might associate that with a Catholic practice, but really, if you read certain sections of the scripture, and the first one that comes to mind is Psalm 119, he is basically saying, God's word. I am so thankful for God's word. He appreciates it, and we also just want to echo how much we love the word of God and how it reveals this king to us and how we are to be living in accordance to it. Now, this passage in Matthew 3, this story, there are parallel passages. There are other writers that give their perspective on this same story, and you see those printed in your notes, and maybe it's coming up on the screens, but it's another way to read about this same instance. Now, Matthew writes not just from this story, but all throughout his gospel. His primary audience that he wrote to were the Jewish people, kind of the insiders. These were the people that grew up in church, so to speak. They grew up, their ancestors for centuries were teaching the scriptures to the children, and this was passed on generation to generation. And so he is talking to these people that were hungry for this promised Messiah. They knew the Old Testament writings, very familiar with them, and they were eager for this Messiah to be made known to them. And this story is really a pivotal story in Jesus' life and also in Matthew's gospel, in that this is kind of the beginning of this marks the beginning of his public ministry. In verse 14, it says, John tried to deter him, saying, in other words, when Jesus said that he wanted John to baptize him, John said, I need to be baptized by you, and do you come to me? Jesus replied, let it be so now. It is proper for us to do this to fulfill all righteousness. Then John consented. It was kind of like John naturally was a little reluctant. I mean, wouldn't we be intimidated to baptize Jesus, okay, if he came to us? And John was kind of saying, I need your spirit and fire baptism. You don't need my water baptism. And it's interesting to note earlier in Matthew 3 that John hesitated to baptize the scribes and Pharisees. So this isn't the first time that he's hesitated to baptize someone, but he does so for a completely different reason. He hesitated to baptize the scribes and the Pharisees because they were not worthy of his water baptism. Now, John has trouble baptizing Jesus because John's baptism is not worthy of Jesus. And so he's wrestling with this feeling of unworthiness. One of the things that I love about our practice of baptism here at Central is that you can be baptized by any other believer, that someone that was influential in your life, for instance. It doesn't have to be a paid professional, a certain ordained individual that baptizes you. Parents can baptize their children. Life group leaders are encouraged to walk their new disciples through the waters of baptism. If there is someone that you are influencing in your workplace and they come to know Christ, then we give you the opportunity to baptize them. And a lot of times that's met with the feeling of, I don't know. I don't know if I'm really worthy to do that. And here's the truth. You're not. You're not. And here's another truth. I'm not either. Glenn's not. None of us are. I mean, when you think about it, this is a big event in someone's life. We don't baptize someone because we are worthy to baptize them. We do it because it's right, because God has commanded it. Just as the Lord said, just as Jesus said to John, I want you to baptize me because this is going to fulfill all righteousness. I want you to do this not because you're worthy, John, but because by doing this, we are fulfilling what God the Father has asked me to do. So when you have an opportunity to baptize someone, really what that is it's your unique opportunity to help this person fulfill what God has asked them to do. Isn't that a cool thing? And really this applies to so many things that we do around here. None of us are really worthy of serving in any way, but we are helping fulfill all righteousness. We are just helping people as they continue on their journey in this way. So John, in baptizing Jesus, was simply doing what needed to be done. It was the proper, right thing to do. And so he was helping with this obedience to the Father. And maybe this is something that you'll have an opportunity and a privilege to do very soon. But it does beg the question, why was Jesus baptized? Because the heart of what John was wrestling with, he was saying, why should I, as a sinful man, baptize you as a sinless man? As we walk through Matthew, we'll see that Jesus led us a sinless life. Paul addresses this in his letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 5:21, or as has been recently said, 2 Corinthians. The Apostle Paul wrote this. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. So Paul is stating what we're going to see firsthand as we go through this. Jesus led a sinless life. So if not to receive John's baptism of repentance, why was Jesus baptized? And I want us to consider three things very quickly here. Three reasons why Jesus was baptized. Number one, it was Jesus' way of identifying himself with the ministry of John the Baptist. For all this time leading up to it, John the Baptist had been heralding the coming of the king, and that Jesus was that king. And Jesus, by being baptized, was identifying himself with the purpose of John's ministry. It was Jesus' way of saying that promised Messiah, that king, that's me. And so he connected himself, identified himself in that way. Reason number two, Jesus also identified himself with the sinful people he came to save. It was as if he was saying, although I'm apart from you in sin, yes, I'm sinless, and you are sinful. Although I'm apart from you in sin, I want you to know I'm with you. I am dedicating myself to help you become a part of this kingdom. You have a desire to be a part of this kingdom, and I want to do my part to help you to help make possible your entrance into this kingdom. And I think of this kind of like, as parents, these are the things that we do for our kids. Have you ever done something, you hear one of your children say, I would really like to, and whatever that is, and so you as a parent, you do whatever you can to make it possible for your child to do that. Maybe your child says, and this is something that Jack said to Beth and I recently, I would like to learn how to play the guitar. Well, it's kind of overplaying some of the terms here, but Beth and I dedicated ourselves to doing what we could do so that it was possible for him to learn how to play the guitar. And so we contacted Jake. We agreed to the $2,000 a month that he wanted for lessons. But it was no big deal. Our son was worth it. No, we helped him get a guitar. We helped set him up for lessons. I remind him to practice. These are all things that I do so that he can fulfill what was on his heart to do. And so there is a way that Jesus was saying to these people, I am dedicating myself to make the life that you want possible. Now, our obedience to the Father, just as Jesus was, is that we see this pattern in the New Testament of obedience to the Father and in the New Testament. And if you are a follower of Jesus and you would like to be baptized, then we as a church want to do our part to make that possible for you. We have a baptistry that is, if you're new here or not been here for a baptism, it's behind this screen. The screen goes up and you not only see the baptistry, but you also see the little wizard that's running everything behind the screen. Yeah, okay, that joke didn't go over well in the first service either. I don't know why I tried it again, but we want to do our part in helping you fulfill what the Father asks you to do. The Father is inviting you to take a step of obedience to follow him in baptism. And if you would like some more information on that Connect card that Brooke and Jenny were talking about, write your name and contact info, write the letter B, circle it, and drop it in the offering or take it out to the Life Path table. We would like to help you with that. If you wanted to be baptized today, we would be willing to do that. The water's cold, but Glenn would be willing to do that. And we want to make it possible for you to follow in obedience. And this step of baptism is such a big event. I don't want to say a little bit more about this in a minute, but 2 weeks ago, I got to baptize my daughter, and I know just still how it was such a key cornerstone moment in her spiritual growth. And I want you to experience what God has for you in that way as well. And just as Jesus is saying, I'm with you in this, you're going to hear a congregation of people that are with you, the cheering, the clapping, the support that you receive. We are with you in this step. Third reason why Jesus was baptized. Jesus' baptism symbolizes what he would do for the salvation of the lost. In this sense, it's kind of like a prophetic act. This prophetic act is just as he was kind of buried and resurrected from a watery grave that day, it was his way of saying, it was a foreshadowing of the death, burial, and resurrection by which we can be saved through faith. And that is when someone is baptized, we often say this, that it's a picture of someone who is dying to their old way of living and burying that, doing away with that. And by God's grace, we are raised to a new life, a new way of living. So Matthew highlights aspects of the story, as I said, that were meaningful to those that were of Hebrew origin and knew the scriptures. And there were a couple of points that I wanted to highlight that they would have picked up on that maybe we wouldn't in our culture. In verse 16, it says, as soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and alighting on him. And this picture of a dove would have meant a lot to Matthew's readers because they would have associated a dove with sacrifice. The sacrificial servant here is what Matthew is wanting us to see in this. We know from what is described to us in Leviticus that a part of their sacrificial system involved the forgiveness of sins involved offering a sacrifice of a dove and a lamb, or if you were poor, 2 doves. And as this was mentioned, this would have connected them in that way in their minds with that sacrificial system. And they would have begun to connect the dots that Jesus is the gentle, innocent, and meek sacrifice for our sins. And then in verse 17, it says, this is my beloved Son. In fact, I want to read this in the English Standard Version because this was the version I was reading at the time, and I want to share how some of these words really came to life in me and held new meaning. Verse 17 says, and behold, a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. The Greek word for beloved means kind of what you would expect, highly esteemed, worthy of love, favorite even. And another way of thinking through this, it's like God was saying, although you are my only child, you are especially loved and cherished. Matthew also uses this word in talking about when it was also mentioned, a voice from heaven during the Mount of Transfiguration. And this story is in Matthew 17. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And a voice from the cloud said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. And again, those familiar with the Old Testament, Matthew's audience, would have remembered some specific verses that were talking about this Davidic kingship lineage and how this was going to be a part of the promised Messiah, the King. In Psalm 2, verse 7, it says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. And then also in Isaiah 42, behold my servant, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. And so we see, as Matthew is kind of laying this foundation, that Jesus is the King. He is this forever sacrifice. We've kind of been looking at it from the people's perspective, but I also want us to consider, what was Jesus' perspective when he heard his Father's voice? This is my beloved son. What went through Jesus' mind as he was hearing these words? Now let's keep in mind the context that we said that this story is kind of where he rounds the corner and begins his public ministry. In other words, up to this point, this is kind of before Jesus really did any of the miracles. This is before he had a large crowd following him. This was before he was working all these wonderful works. He heard a voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved." And it was in this time of transition when I had all of these jobs and I was wrestling with my identity that I read some books on this, because this was really something that was especially meaningful to me. And this was became kind of a pivotal point in my spiritual journey as well. But I got to thinking about Jesus squeezed in a lot of doing in 3 years of ministry. He did a lot of things, but from the onset, we read here in this story today, it was his being, not his doing, that identified him. He was the beloved. And although Jesus did miraculous things, he didn't desire an identity or crave to be miraculous. He, as the beloved, did spectacular things, but he did not have to be spectacular to prove himself to God or to others. And I believe it was because of this momentous naming that Jesus would be able to daily surrender his wannabe self and daily crucify the what others want me to be self, and to rest as the beloved. Now, again, going back to my story as a Starbucks barista, I began each shift by writing my name and title on a badge that was affixed to a cash drawer. And the oddity of it struck me that here I am wrestling with my identity, with my sense of worth and value, and I'm affixing that to a cash drawer. I thought the irony of that was rather rich. But I began at that point to make some changes. But they weren't changes in my job status. I wanted to see about bringing changes to how I identified myself, to how I was named and labeled. So after a few weeks of writing Gary Barista, I did something a little bit different. I wrote on that card, "Hello, my name is," and then I left it blank. Because earlier I'd been looking at the name tags that we get. "Hello, my name is." You've worn them at conferences or something like that. And you jot your name down. And I just wrote, "Hello, my name is," and I left it blank. And I attached it to my cash drawer. And sure enough, it didn't take long before a coworker asked if I had forgotten my name. And haha and all that stuff. And my response to their comment was as much a teaching moment for myself as it was to really state anything to them. But I said, I left my name tag blank as a reminder that no one names me except God. God is the one that names me. That that my value and my worth is based on who God says I am, not what someone else says I am or that I should be. So it begs the question, who does God say that I am? I am one who is made righteous by Jesus the King. I am one who has been granted access to the kingdom of heaven. I am, by faith, saved by Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. I am, because of Jesus, beloved. I am God's beloved child. And I journaled a few thoughts. It's a blog post that I wrote a few years later, and it's going to come up on the screen if it helps some of this sink in. God, you graciously call me beloved. Strip me of the notions of my wannabe self and my wish I wasn't self. The false self has to go. Now, I know what my false self is. It is anything I'm identified by other than beloved. My false self, instead of resting in being the beloved, expends enormous energy to be witty, to be strong, to be unique, to be right, be good, and even be spiritual. Lead me to rest as beloved. Today, Lord, I accept my calling to be loved by you. Beloved, be loved. In all I do, loved. In all my not doing, loved. As I reflected on this story 2 weeks ago, when my daughter Callie was baptized, I pictured a voice from heaven also saying the same thing to her. Just as God the Father said to Jesus, "This is my beloved Son." I kind of made this my prayer. This is Callie, your beloved child, and you are well pleased with her and her decision to follow you. Callie is beloved. Lord, in all she does and does not do, may she know herself to be loved. I want my girl to know that she's loved no matter what. That's the gospel. That's the good news. Because of what Jesus has done, we are loved. He loves us unconditionally. She asked a question just a couple of days after her baptism. It was at night, laying there in her bed as we were talking, recapping the day and saying prayers and things like that. She looked at me and she said a question that really isn't a question that a kid asks. I think it's a question that adults ask too. She said, "Now that I have Jesus in my heart and I've been baptized, will I go to heaven even if I mess up? Will God still love me?" Great question, isn't it? And I responded with a question. I said, "Callie, if you were to disobey mommy or daddy, big if, hardly ever happens, but if you were to disobey your mother or I, would you still be our daughter?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, can you remember a time, even kind of recently, where we were correcting you for something that you did that was wrong, but as we were correcting you, we're still saying, "I love you"? And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, you are loved by a perfect Heavenly Father, and He calls you beloved in all that you do." I'm going to invite the band up. And I was reading a book by Wayne Mueller recently, and this quote from there, this is a part of it that I underlined and stood out. It says, "All souls are thirsting for this same living water, to be seen, known, and loved just as we are." And I couldn't help but kind of wonder, Jesus, as the living water, was baptized in the Jordan, in those waters, and he was seen, known, and loved as the beloved. And what a gift that is for us. So I want to ask you just a couple of questions as we prepare for our prayer time and response. Are you leaning all your weight on your good works? Are you wearily attempting to live up to a particular reputation or identity, a title? Or will you slump exhaustedly at the gracious feet of Jesus? Will you find rest as one who is made righteous by the work of Jesus? Will you accept that you, right here as you are the beloved? And we're going to have people that will, in just a moment, make their way down here to pray with you. Maybe you want to just come and have someone pray and celebrate that you are the beloved. Maybe you want to know what this is like to enter into this family of God, to be saved, and to be known as the beloved. Maybe you have some questions about baptism, all of those things. But I'm going to invite you right now to stand to your feet. We would love to help you with whatever it is your next step is. And we want to celebrate that we are God's beloved. And maybe even just the knowledge and acceptance of your identity as the beloved will change the way that you sing this next song. Let me pray for you. Father, For those of us that have such a performance-based mindset, we breathe a sigh of relief. We thank you for your forgiveness, your grace, and your unconditional love. In Jesus' name, amen.